I'll just say, I won't spend a lot of time talking about myself, even though I'm a lawyer, so you might expect that I would do. Until about 2.5 years ago, I headed a legal service at Nottinghamshire County Council, and then grabbed the pension while I was still there during the restructuring. And since then, I've been doing some training and writing overview reports for serious case reviews. And in Wales, during that period of time, I've written 12 overview reports, so I feel as if I've got quite a lot of information on which to draw. Technology is working. Put a more high-tech video, if that doesn't work, but I might have to stretch up. So, I've got a lot of slides, a lot of information. I'm going to go through it quickly, but we can send you the copies of the slides which appear up on the screen, so you don't feel as if you've got to write down anything that actually appears up on the screen. We can't put pictures of children up, so I use my golden retriever. I call this frozen watchfulness. People recognise that phrase, frozen watchfulness? It's usually about 50%, I think, of an audience, multi-professional audience, multi-agency audience usually recognise the term. In one of the high-profile public inquiries during the 1980s, professional staff were criticised for not recognising frozen watchfulness in children, as very small children sit, not wanting to do anything, not wanting to look at anybody, not wanting to move, because whatever they do, they're visiting something trouble, and so they become very quiet. About 2 or 3 years, we all looked for frozen watchfulness after the publication of that report, and gradually, as we can see, if there's 50% of people who mean something, that gets lost as we concentrate on something else, as we peel the onion skin off and we concentrate on something else. I think one of the things I'm going to say is we've got to bring that learning forward and keep it. And if we lose sight of it, then we miss the opportunity to make a difference. And with dogs, if you treat them well and you love them and you feed them well, that's organic. So you do get good results. And here's my exception to putting children's pictures up. A bit of sharing of information. If you know who this child is, you must say. Because he's busy spreading swine flu around the country. My first message really is it's not easy, and that's the lesson from serious case reviews, and it's a lesson from research, and it's a lesson from our own experience in practice. It's not easy, and we have to work hard at it, and we have to be vigilant, and we have to ensure that the things that we expect to be happening down on the ground are actually happening. That would be one of the main thrusts of what I'm saying. We know Victoria very well, don't we? The picture of the other little girl, who is Maria Colwell, is perhaps not so recognisable to people. But we wouldn't have known anything about those children had they not died in the circumstances in which they died. Their lives would probably be unremarkable, wouldn't they? And it's now, I think, worth thinking about that it's over 60 years since the first big inquiry into a child death during the 1940s. Dennis O'Neill was beaten and starved to death by his foster parents in Newport in Shropshire. And that led to the first inquiry with recommendations for agencies. It's dreadful if you can remember this, 40 years since Maria Colwell. If you were around at the time, it's pretty dreadful to think it's 40 years, isn't it? And of course, the recommendations in that inquiry, a lot of them led to the establishment of area review committees and then child protection committees would have come local safeguarding children laws. It's now, this is dreadful to think as well, it's 8 years since Victoria Clandier's case, a big inquiry, 150 recommendations. And what were they really, the main thrusts of all those recommendations? What did they recommend? Should be better working together, should be better sharing information. So we've been struggling with it for 60 years. So we have to try harder. And one of the things I'll be saying is we've now got the legislative framework from which we can confidently say things are in place so that we can do these things. We can do these things better, and I'll be talking about that a little bit. Local serious case reviews have involved very young children, babies. You'll see within the circumstances that led to the injuries of those children. Familiar themes: stress, prematurity, special needs, stressful pregnancy, distressing medical intervention for the child causing stress within the family, 2-day-old child in fatal methadone, and by her mother, long history of drug misuse, 2 children smothered by their father with a long history of mental illness, and a teenager who committed suicide. Now, I was interested to read the executive summaries of those serious case reviews and just compare them to the serious case reviews which I've been dealing with in other places throughout Wales. Just very quickly going through those. First one was a child aged who was seriously sexually abused in a foster home between the age of 6 and 10. Teenagers, 4 teenagers, and this is becoming unfortunately more common, choking on their own vomit, after taking a cocktail of heroin and other drugs over many years, being seriously sexually exploited for many years, domestic abuse in the background. 2 children who have committed suicide, domestic abuse in the background, 2 children in respect of whom there was serious physical and sexual abuse, long-term neglect in the background, and again, domestic abuse in the background. 2 new babies, both left with serious disabilities where they need lifelong care throughout the rest of their life and injured within the first few days really of their life. Young carers, depression, domestic abuse in the background. Fabricated and induced illness, which is rare, of course, isn't it? But that's a child, a baby in Swansea who was murdered by her mother. And there was a history of a previous baby with fractured ribs, and again, a history of domestic abuse. And 4 children, 47 agencies involved in the serious case review involving those 4 children. Long history of neglect and serious sexual abuse, and again, domestic abuse in the background. So we've got some familiar things. Now, what I want to talk about is the framework within which our practice is expected to be delivered on the ground, because we don't just pluck it out of the air, do we? Actually, it's got some drivers, and it's got some imperatives. They're statutory, policy, practice, and guidance imperatives. That's what we're expected. That's what we're expected to deliver. Really, I don't know why that's happened. It'd be very clever if I did it deliberately, wouldn't it? So we've got policy imperatives, practice imperatives, and legal imperatives, and these things feed each other, don't they? We do things in a particular way, and we think, actually, if we'd done that a little bit differently, we might have had a better outcome. So we think, well, we'll do it differently, and we'll see what outcome we get, and so our practice develops. And that practice might be because there's a policy, there's an intention to deliver something, and the practice, therefore, needs to take account of the policy. If we don't know the policy, then we won't deliver the practice in the way which is expected. Sometimes it's so important that that expectation becomes a legal, statutory imperative. We must do it. And then that feeds the practice, and we practice a bit more, and it doesn't turn out as well as we expect. And so these three things feed each other. The policy may change, there may be a new policy, which is reflected in the legal imperative, and the practice is expected to change to reflect that. And that practice takes place within the context of what we know. And we know a lot more than we did, certainly when I started in child protection work, which is longer than I'm going to tell you ago. And we know, don't we? These are the issues that we need to take account of and act if we know that they're present in a family, and particularly if there's a small child in the family. Mental illness, domestic abuse, alcohol misuse, drug misuse. And you'll see from my quick synopsis of those serious case reviews, these are familiar themes in the cases that led to serious injuries or deaths in relation to children. Immature adults, I say immature because age isn't the issue, is it actually? It's the maturity of those that are caring for these children. A man who's not the father of the child, being particularly with very small children, who joins the household during the pregnancy, who is nevertheless treated by agencies as if he was the father. That's a familiar feature in serious case reviews. And of course financial pressures and poor housing. Now, because we haven't got a lot of time, I just want to say a couple of things about these things. Mental illness, actually, in most cases, it's not about psychotic illness, serious psychotic illness, or schizophrenia, or something clearly, obviously present. It's about depression, anxiety, not being able to get up in the morning, preferring to be asleep while things like kids. That's the mental illness, and that's what people in the cases that I've gathered missed as being significant, and the impact on the quality of care which children receive. And it's not that I don't think now staff don't recognise that domestic abuse in the background of the family is important. The problem is what to do about it. It's the practice that should follow from recognising that as domestic abuse and recognising that you need to know the full extent of what's actually occurred within a family and inquire and investigate sufficiently to understand what children have been exposed to. What else do we know? Well, in England, we've got the dark shadow of Ofsted operation that's done. Unfortunately, you don't have that in Wales. It's not a very pleasant experience for people in practice to suddenly be landed on by an Ofsted inspection. But one of the things they do, which is useful, is draw lessons from the serious case reviews, which are carried out in England. And in 2007-2008, they looked at 173 serious case reviews, extracting the themes. And one of the points they were making was this: it's salutary to be reminded that the most common risk factor in cases reviewed was neglect. So neglect was the concern, but the neglect was the household in which there was neglect was the very household in which the children then suffered very serious injury or death. So neglect is the message from that is neglect is serious, not just because of the impact of neglect, but because it's very likely that within that neglect children will suffer those more serious circumstances. And I think this is important. It's distressing to read, for example, how often nobody thought to ask a child who was clearly unhappy what was wrong. This was in a record of a child who went on to have 4 more years of neglect before suffering serious physical and sexual abuse, which was the trigger to actually take some protective action in relation to him. At age 3, he was recorded as being his usual really self. And I think with hindsight, of course, and as with ever the serious case reviews, we are looking at the circumstances with hindsight, so we can see how things have turned out. But of course, to record that and not be concerned about why is the bit that we're anxious about, isn't it, actually? Who watches CBeebies? I have my granddaughter on my knee now, in the night garden. Is that familiar to you? She sits on my knee and we sing the song, don't we? At the end of a lovely day, the time has come to say good night. It's the end of a lovely day. We've had so much fun today. Tomorrow's just a dream away, and now it's time to say good night at the end of a lovely day. And I think as I sit there on my knee, and then she gets taken upstairs and tucked up in a nice duvet and a mobile, it does occur to me actually that her life experience is a million miles away, not just slightly different from those children I've just been talking about. It's a million miles away from the life experiences which those children have. And I think that when we get immersed in the day-to-day responses in relation to families, we sometimes lose sight of actually the stark difference between what we would hope for our children and what they're actually, the circumstances in which they're actually living. What else do we know? Well, this is another Ofsted publication, but this time they've taken the themes from the 4 years that they've been evaluating serious case reviews. They take them annually, and they also they've now taken a 4-year stretch. I think they're fearing that they're going to be abolished shortly with the cuts that come, so they're doing the best they can with the information they've got. So they took 4 years from 2007 to 2011. 608 children who've been the subject of serious case reviews. 35% of those children were under 12 months of age, with the majority being under 3 months of age. More likely to be killed during the first 3 months of life, 8 times more likely to be killed during the first 3 months of your life than any other age. And that's a dreadful, dreadful thing to have to acknowledge, isn't it? At the time when you're most entitled to expect care and love and protection, that's the time when babies are most at risk. And the lessons to be drawn from those cases from Ofsted was that practitioners underestimated their fragility. And what they were saying was, we need to act quickly if we have concerns about those very children. If we delay, if we leave it, then that very instant that might happen with such dreadful impact because of the fragility of the baby might occur. But what I thought was interesting though as well was, that's the very young. Actually, we'd expect them to be a high proportion of serious case reviews because of their fragility. But if you take the age group 14 to 18 years, they take up a quarter of serious case reviews. And if you include the 11 to 18-year-olds, it becomes 40%. So the vulnerability of that age group is similar to the vulnerability of the under 12 months or under 3 month age group. And the seriousness of what may occur in terms of incidents in risky behaviour that are indulging is exposing them to similar risks of seriousness, very different in character and context, obviously, but similar dangers as the first 12 months or first 3 months. I'm going to Jane Barlow will be looking at very young children later on. So in my presentation, I'm going to concentrate more on that older age group. But what Ofsted found was that in both those, and this is reflected in the Welsh serious case reviews, with both those age groups, the very young, we know that fragile, particularly serious risk, and those older children, too often the safeguarding procedures are not being used early enough or not used at all in circumstances when it's clear that they should have been used. So Ofsted says in their review, well, why not? Why haven't staff followed the child protection procedures? It's not as if they're ambiguous in being writing procedures for so many years now. It's not the procedures that we need to alter, is it? It's the behaviour around those procedures. So what Ofsted says, it's because staff are either unaware of the procedural requirements or they know about them but fail to act in accordance with those procedures. And I think we need to focus on why that might be the case in the circumstances in which it occurs. I just want to look quickly then in that context of how we get from the policy down to practice. So government in a general sense forms the policy. It might be that children should be better protected from abuse and neglect. Sometimes the policy is much more focused than that, but if we take that general policy, what happens then is the government arranges for legislation to be put in place which gives duties and responsibilities to different agencies to deliver particular services in a particular way in order to deliver that policy that children will be better protected from abuse and neglect. Then government departments that have got responsibility for those different areas of service will typically, when they publish guidance about how those legislative provisions ought to be, how those services ought to be delivered, working together. Well, actually, when I cleared my office out after 34 years of, you find all sorts of things buried under the papers, unanswered memoranda from 1982, for example. But I also found working together in 1988. A little bit different, isn't it? A little bit different from what's expected. So government departments publish guidance. A lot of us then get busy locally drafting procedures and protocols in response to that guidance. And then down at the bottom, practice is expected to change in some way in order to reflect those processes. And the problem is that if something goes wrong on the way down, so that down here there's not a clear understanding of what's up there, then the practice will not change. If we have the time, I can give you a lot of examples of where the policy is good, the legislation's in place, but there hasn't been a change in practice. And that can happen because the procedures and protocols, well drafted as they are, aren't clear about what the policy is. What are we trying, what's expected to be achieved by the procedures and protocols. And that when the procedures and protocols are drafted, they're relying on the guidance and not seeing the guidance as an aid to the delivery of the legislation rather than a substitute for it. And so on the way down, people in practice, if they don't understand what the policy is, what we're expected to achieve, and what the legislation requires us to do, then our practice will not change. And that's a familiar feature which I'm going to explore a little bit. So, what are the legal policy and practice imperatives underpinning procedural requirement is as important as knowing what the procedural requirement is. What are they expected to deliver? Here's a little example from private eye. We read that very often. The policy says you have to see a doctor within 4 hours. This is him on holiday in Tunisia. And of course, there we have it, don't we? In the way that sometimes private eye can capture these little things, don't they? That's not what the policy is expected to achieve, clearly, obviously. Does that mean a lot of reading? Yes, it does actually, but with the internet we can read these things a lot more easily than we could do. On that website, the government has put every piece of current legislation that's in force in the United Kingdom in its amended form, in its current form. So Children Act 1989 appears on that website as it is in 2012, not as it was in 1989. And that's useful. In this website, you can get access to all the important cases where the judgments are delivered in the High Court, Court of Appeal, what is now used to be the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court, and the Court of Human Rights. Sometimes within hours of the judgment being delivered, but certainly within days of those judgments being delivered. So if we think that a case receives publicity that seems to suggest that we should be handled differently, then let's read the case actually, because usually that's not the case. And on that website, the Care Council of Wales, there's some very useful material on the legal framework for childcare, the legislation related to childcare, easily accessible, easily readable. So we can get access to these materials much more easily. Here's my dog, reading away, past the family. Now let me give an example of what I'm really talking about from a case. Looked after child, sexually abused by the adopted son of the foster mother for 4 years, from the age of 6 to 10. This was serious. This was anal rape, committed 3, 4, 5 times a week over a period of 4 years. And there were lots of issues involved in the case, but I was particularly concerned to know why she didn't tell someone. That seemed to me right at the centre. She was looked after the child, she had a social worker, they were looked after children abused, to which their interagency processes. She was attending school, attended school every day, and yet she didn't tell anybody. So I arranged for the LSBCC Advocacy Service to do some sensitive work, just to tease out why did you not tell someone. Now, what's the policy around dealing with, there are lots of policy issues, but one of the policies to deal with dealing with children who are particularly vulnerable. That's the way children in foster care are categorised. That's the category in which they are working together. They come within that chapter that deals with children who are particularly vulnerable, because we know they are particularly vulnerable. Social workers are required to see children in foster care on their own for a proportion of visits, and evidence of this should be recorded. She was seen on her own. She was taken very routinely to sit at McDonald's, and that was recorded as having happened by a social worker. That expectation of working together reflects the statutory regulations built around children who are looked after by local authorities. But why? Why is it important to see a child on their own who's in foster home? It's the important issue that I wanted to have a look at. What are the policy and practice imperatives behind that legal requirement? Foster care is undertaken in the private domain of the carer's own homes. This may make it more difficult to identify abusive situations and for children to find a voice outside the family. It gives us an indication of why it's important, doesn't it? It's in statutory regulations, it says in order that a relationship can be formed with the child to be concerns. It's a measure of child protection. This performs the child protection element. So it's recognised that children in foster homes may suffer significant harm. And so seeing on their own is concerned with that child protection element. And we know children actually don't tell professionals, so it's a different piece of work, isn't it? This is the statistics around children telling about the abuse, sexual abuse which they're suffering. Typically, they don't tell at the time. If they tell a friend. More likely to tell their mother. And that's 2007. So we know that actually they're unlikely to say, unlikely to tell. Don't know if anybody reads P.D. James. Detective novels. I like reading detective novels because they can put them down and pick them up without worrying about whether you can remember what happened. Can't pick them up. This is a paragraph about Cordelia, who is actually a private detective but spent her life in care. Cordelia had early learned stoicism. All her foster carers, kind and well-meaning in their different ways, had demanded one thing of her, that she should be happy. She had quickly learned that to show unhappiness was to risk the loss of love. Compared with this early discipline of concealment, all subsequent deceits have been easy. I think that's a nice little capture of what we know is the position and how difficult it is, therefore, to actually discover what's happening. And that's policy, practice, knowledge that sits behind seeing a child on their own, isn't it? Reader and Duncan in their Lost Innocence, I carried it out with it, still with Reed, it's 1999, but it draws on the lessons of serious cases we used to call them partake reviews in the old days. Partake reviews prior to 2009. And it's another little phrase, I like little phrases that you can just keep in your head that encourage you to, in your practice. Professional practice is based on covert behaviours for the worst case scenario. And I think that's right. We don't treat every case as the worst case, but we do enough to satisfy ourselves that it's not. We covertly prepare for the fact that it might be the worst case. Now, with this little girl who was sexually abused, the work that came from the NSBC's advocacy worker was this. She considered her social worker as showing false friendliness. Her social worker was rushed and never asked questions more than once. For example, she would ask me how I was and I would say fine. If she had asked me again, for example, are you really sure? I don't think I would have hidden it, and I may have let it all out. And I think that's helpful, isn't it? So, actually, the policy imperative, the practice imperative, is not to see a child on their own so they can tell you. It's actually so we can find out. And we have to do enough to find out. And I thought that's, if you think back to my chart of policy and practice, that was what needed to be understood when it was understood that as a matter of law, this child had to be seen on their own outside the foster home. You see my point? It's actually understanding what is actually expected to be delivered. What else do we know about this flow down from policy down to practice. Well, the Welsh Government arranged for the Health and Wellbeing and Local Government Committee to carry out an inquiry into the functioning of children at the University of Safeguarding Children Laws. The report was published in 2010. One of the things they had to say was in their evidence, they identified a disconnect between the strategic work of the boards and the knowledge and awareness of frontline practitioners. So that flowing down from policy, strategic work, down into practice, the danger of them being lost on the way down in terms of messages is just as acute as the policy and legislation not being properly understood in practice on the ground. So what do the serious case reviews tell us about what that committee was identifying? Well, one of the local serious case reviews in the executive summary, it describes the history of mental illness in the family, and that should say not and that the authors were concerned that despite the fact that a flawed protocol, they weren't very happy with the protocol that existed, but there was a protocol, a flawed protocol existed about communication between adult mental health and children's professionals. The local team were unaware of its existence. So that expectation of communication between adult mental health professionals and children's care workers, that had been understood. Strategically, the protocol had been put in place, but somehow that hadn't got its way down into practice, and so it didn't actually. And that's what the committee was identifying. Have I come across that in the serious case reviews that I've been looking at? The answer is yes. I'll give you a stark example. In Bridgend, in particular, there was a lot of attention, as you remember, on suicides. Actually, the statistics aren't that great in other areas, but the press picked it up and ran with it. But a lot of work went in strategically to develop strategies on how to minimise and deliver the Welsh Government's strategy on reducing suicide. And that strategy expected that agencies would develop services in order that the strategy could be delivered. And to assist early identification of risk and referral to specialist groups, and a whole range of training introduced to equip staff to more easily recognise and readily recognise when children, particularly young people, were at risk of suicide or self-harm. So that's the strategy. A lot of work on it, strategy put in place. I dealt with the case of a 13-year-old boy who committed suicide, and one of the things we did in the serious case review was look at how that strategy had actually been delivered on the ground. And what we found was that actually, despite all the work, the frontline workers were unaware of the strategy and what it said. And the agencies hadn't actually gone away from that strategic work and delivered services within their agencies to deliver that strategy. We found no evidence of any development within the agencies of that strategy. As far as the training was concerned, no teacher at this young boy's school had attended the training, not one. And in the whole of the borough, only one teacher had attended training, which was designed to equip people to more readily identify when children were at risk of suicide. And the board, it was acknowledged, collected no information about who actually attended the interagency training which they approved and put in place in terms of no teachers attending that training, for example, which was one of the very groups that actually needed, because they had much more contact with those people, one of the very groups that should have been taking advantage of this training. So if you think of my policy down to practice, good work, and that's what the committee, I think, was talking about, good work up there, but it's got to be delivered. So we've got to be vigilant. We've got to make sure that staff and managers are aware of what's actually expected in terms of that delivery, and they've understood the why. Not just that they've understood the new procedures, but they've understood why we've got new procedures. What was it that needed addressing, and why we've got those new procedures. And persistently, because things can drift. We focus on something else, and we need to be vigilant about whether what we expect to be happening on the ground is actually happening on the ground. Not that people are working hard, but they're working hard in a way in which they're expected in order to deliver those messages. Child exploitation. Just want to say a few words about that. We found my sort of indication that child protection procedures, even if they're known about, have not been followed, is particularly acute for older children. In cases that I've dealt with, those children have been typically died, as I say, after years of sexual exploitation, drug, alcohol, misuse, choking on their vomit. Usually, if it's girls, usually in the bed of a 30-year-old man at the age of 16. And despite it being evident that this was serious harm, even death, over a number of years, from early teenage years to the time that they died, no child protection procedures were followed, no referrals, no interventions, strategy for dealing with the difficulties. So what we have there is a sort of lack of recognition that actually the legislative framework on child protection procedures continue until a child is 18. There's nothing in any of our procedures that say, except children over 16. There's nothing that says that. And yet, these are cases and examples of how we can so easily drift in to program on attitude that misses that. So, what about child exploitation procedures? Well, typically not followed. And of course, the Welsh Government's been picking this up, and nationally has been delivering some powerful guidance around these issues. But perpetrators free to abuse, as a result, others. So not just the child we're concerned about, but other children who have been abused by the same predatory perpetrators. The suppliers of drugs and alcohol not investigated, none of them prosecuted. In fact, none of the cases I've been involved in has any perpetrator been prosecuted for sexual abuse and the supply of drugs. The Republicans, no risk of losing their licence for giving alcohol to children who are obviously underage and drunk. That has to be contrasted with the speedy action that's taken against these young people if they get involved in criminal activities. So several of them have been off to young offenders institutions on 2 or 3 times during those teenage years for indulging in activities which, if they were an adult, they would certainly not have been sent to prison. So they're actually being sent off with wider eyes in order to protect them from the activities which their criminal jurisdiction magistrates take a step, because nothing is actually being done. And of course the public are being inconvenienced by these criminal activities of these young people. So that's a contrast with the lack of action against those who are actually abusing and exploiting these young people. So what we have to be vigilant about then when we're dealing with these young people is we do take action against the perpetrators, and that's a priority, because if we take action against the perpetrators, they will not be carrying out the abuse of not just the young person we're concerned about, but other young people who they will similarly abuse. Any other themes that come forward through those cases involving young children? Well, ascertaining the wishes and feelings of those young people, which is a proper thing to do. We have to understand what children are different from their views instead, isn't it? Much more complex. Ascertaining what children wish and feel, young people wish and feel. That's very different from asking them what they want. It's a much more complicated piece of work. But what typically happens in those cases is that that becomes deferring to those young people about what should happen in relation to them, or more often what should not happen. And then there becomes a fear that if we try and actually take some action to protect them, they'll actually take some actions which make it worse. They'll do something even worse, so the agency's back off. And what that does is actually give to these young people the responsibility of deciding what is happening when they're damaged, vulnerable young people. And we have to be vigilant, as I've said before, in insisting the responsibility to decide what happens is not the young person's responsibility. It's the responsibility of the professionals who are involved in forming judgments. And those judgments and those considerations must include with these young people at least considering whether they should be placed in secure accommodation for their own safety and their own welfare, not just simply sent off to young offenders institutions because they happen to steal from the open supermarket. Or typically, then, if they're subject to orders of the criminal court, they don't turn up, they don't obey them, and then they get dealt by the courts for not obeying orders, and then off to circumstances in which, for a short period of time, they're safe, but not long enough to actually affect any change in their approach and behaviour. There's something about the language we use in those cases as well that comes from these serious case reviews. So in one of them, a girl who was not yet 12 years old was described as having a sexual relationship with an older man. She was not prepared to give any details regarding her partner. Well, she's not having a sexual relationship, is she? Actually, she's being seriously sexually abused, isn't she? And she hasn't got a partner, actually. She's a victim of a predatory, abusive man. And if we don't describe it like that, then it becomes much, much softer. At 13, another girl was described as having sexual intercourse with a 24-year-old substance user and registered sex offender. That's not a proper description, is it, of what's actually happening? She put herself in situations of harm. She didn't, actually. She didn't. This man was taking advantage of a vulnerable young girl and exploiting and abusing her seriously. And that's been picked up by the Welsh Government in the recent guidance, last year's guidance on safeguarding children and young people, that the language we use must be appropriate. Otherwise, it encourages desensitisation of the circumstances, it normalises it, and more risky, it allocates the responsibility for what's actually happening to the child. They've got a relationship with this older person. Actually, it's not a relationship. It's their victims, and we have to use the language which reflects that. Going back to my policy down to practice, because that's the theme, as you may have noticed. Safeguarding children is everyone's responsibility, is a policy, isn't it? Expected to be delivered. That says, stressed out my ass, I'm going to kill the next son of a bitch who says I was stressed. And that's really a reminder that this is stressful work. And because it's stressful, the capacity for falling out, for local professionals and for agencies to fall out, is huge, actually. It is. And that adds to the stress, doesn't it? If safeguarding children is truly everyone's responsibility, it's much less likely that that stress will be engendered, because we would share the responsibility for what's happening. We would all share the responsibility for the quality of what's being done. The quality of what's being done by others, as well as the quality of what is being done by us, because we would be sharing, because responsibility, because it's all our responsibilities. So that's the policy. How is that delivered? If you think of my chart, down through legislation. Well, Section 28 of the Children Act 2004, Section 175 of the Education Act 2002, both implemented in 2006, with a 2-year run-in and a 4-year run-in. As far as Wales were concerned, it was earlier in England, a year earlier in England, but the running period to prepare for delivering that policy expectation through that legislation. This is all of us going in the same direction, all together. I nearly said in the same boat, but that would be mixing the same wheelbarrow. So, now, what is the policy behind those legislative provisions? Well, sometimes it's useful to go and read the speeches of ministers when the second reading of a bill is in House of Commons or the House of Lords, or as in the Welsh Government, in the Assembly, as it becomes more responsible for more legislative arrangements. If you read the speeches of ministers when they present the bill, when they're promoting the bill, you'll learn about what that policy imperative is, and you can get to those speeches on the internet very easily. They will describe what was wrong, what needed to be right, what the legislation says, what will be different, what is expected to be different. What I've done here is just pluck some phrases out of the ministers' speeches in the Commons and the Lords when the Children Bill was making its way through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Right here in this, if that's what the legislation is expected to achieve, if we just do the same as we've always done with a little bit of tinkering, we've missed the plot, haven't we? What it's expected to achieve is a radical and fundamental change, a programme of fundamental reform, a step change of how we safeguard and protect children, a strengthening of child protection, a transformation of children's services, a shift of emphasis to prevention and early intervention. So if we just do the same, slightly differently, we've missed it. Something very, very different is expected to come from that legislation, and that's the policy. That's the policy that's expected. So in the serious case reviews that I've been involved in, we've been specifically looking at what's happened on the ground to see whether there's a reflection in practice of that fundamental change of approach. The legislative provisions of Section 28 require that the agencies listed in Section 28 carry out all their functions having regard to the need to safeguard the welfare of children, including when they arrange for other agencies to deliver services rather than doing them themselves, so commissioning services or arranging for services from voluntary agencies. There's a statutory duty to ensure that the services are delivered having regard to the need to safeguard the welfare of children. All agencies have the same duty. Everything they do should be done having regard to the need to safeguard the welfare of children. Not just services to children, services to adults. No services to adults or children at all. HR functions, environmental health functions, licensing functions, all have to be carried out having regard to the need to safeguard the welfare of children. That's the legislative vehicle through which the policy, which is safeguarding children as everyone's responsibility, is expected to be delivered. Do you see? If you think back to my chart, that's the legislation. But if all those delivering services on the ground don't understand that they're now required to behave very, very differently, then that policy won't be delivered, and the legislation won't be properly implemented. So we have to think. This is somebody having a think about practically how this would happen. What is actually expected is this. The cultural shift was to shift from us thinking of ourselves as different services. We might be in different agencies, but we've got to think of ourselves, and that's the cultural shift, that's the policy. We should think of ourselves as being different parts of a single service for children. And of course, that has an impact on sharing information, doesn't it? As we'll see in a moment, and in the workshop, if you come to my workshop. But that's, if we all have a duty to carry out our responsibilities, having regard to the safeguarding the welfare of children, we have a share of that responsibility, and that means sharing information becomes much, much easier, doesn't it? If we're all part, if we think of ourselves as all part of the same service rather than being different services that are being delivered. Did we find that radical cultural shift on the ground in the cases that we looked at for serious case reviews? And the answer is no. That radical. And now, of course, we're 6 years on from the implementation of that piece of legislation, whereas I've said the policy is clear, the legislation's in place, but somehow, going down that chart, we haven't got to deliver on the ground a reflection of that huge change that is expected. One of the recommendations of the committee that looked at the functioning of local safeguarding children boards was that Welsh Government should ensure that board guidance addresses the over-reliance on social services departments and reaches the responsibility of all organisations at national, regional and local levels working effectively together to protect children. That's the policy. And as I said earlier, the legislation is now in place. We might have been struggling for 60 years, but the legislation is there, the policy is clear, we're just going to get on and deliver it in accordance with that policy expectation. So through our strategy meetings, through carrying out assessments, through child protection conferences, core group meetings, there's an individual and collective responsibility for the effectiveness in ensuring all that information is considered. So a core group considering an assessment has a responsibility for the quality of that assessment, not just the individual or the agency that is producing an assessment. It's incumbent on everyone involved in the process to be satisfied that that's a good, effective piece of work. And if it's not, we've got to speak up, we've got to talk about it and say that. Which brings me to the need for testing and challenging. Consensus is a good thing, isn't it, actually? But if we arrive at consensus without the necessary testing and challenging of the options and the quality of what's gone before, then we're missing a great chunk of area of shared responsibility for the quality of those processes. So there's a responsibility on everybody involved in those processes to ensure that we're operating properly, that assessments are completed and effectively carried out. I just finished dealing with a case where a core assessment took over 3 years to be completed. And yet there were regular interagency meetings taking place every 3 months. And yet none of the other agencies were saying, hang on a minute, what's happened to this core assessment, which of course was useless by the time it was actually considered. And there's a proactive requirement, isn't there? Because if we all have to carry out all our functions having regard to the need to safeguard and promote the welfare of children, that's a proactive responsibility to be continually thinking about what we should be doing to ensure that children are properly safeguarded and the welfare promoted. So it means if there's an assessment taking place and I haven't been asked to contribute, I should be insisting on contributing, because I should be thinking. My experience, my knowledge, what I know, needs to be part of that assessment, and to test and challenge the quality of what comes through. And working together 2006 told us, didn't it, that multi and interagency work to safeguard and promote children's welfare starts as soon as there are concerns about a child's welfare, not just when there are questions about possible harm. So our interagency collaboration should start as soon as we have the concerns, not just, as they would say, wait for the serious incident that triggers just a procedural response. So what have we found in the serious case reviews? Well, inadequate assessments accepted by managers and interagency groups without criticism or challenge, judgments not properly reasoned, lack of a forensic approach to those issues, real focus on what is it we actually need to know in order to form a judgment about this issue. A lot of collecting of information, although not always enough information, particularly about histories, but lack of evaluation and analysis of that information. So what is it that this tells us? Not we know this, but what is it that it tells us? And that includes drawing appropriate inferences from what we know, and it includes thinking forward and saying and thinking, well, from what we know, what's likely to happen? with those teenagers who were persistently involving themselves in activities which led them to be sexually exploited by different older men who were supplying drugs and alcohol. If anybody at any point had said, well, what do you think is likely to happen? The very thing that happened with those young people was the thing that must have been identified if that forward-looking question had been asked, rather than just dealing on the day-to-day presentations from those children. We found that the framework for assessment, which is designed to help carry out assessments in relation to these cases, had often not been read by the staff who were involved in carrying out the assessments. Plans may be in existence, but there were vague and generalised objectives with a lack of clarity about who is to do what, when and how, and no contingency arrangements. So if our plan doesn't work, what we've been described as very, very serious. Or morbidity. What does that mean? Is it concerned with death? Or is it concerned with sickness or disease? The answer is sickness or disease. Whereas again, 50 or 60% usually will say it's to do with death. Of course, the word for death is mortality. But you can see, if we don't explain what we're saying, particularly going outside our small professional groups where we use shorthand, and we all understand it in the group, if we don't communicate that well when we share it outside, we'll miss it. Make no assumptions about knowledge. I'll just give you, this is my last point, example of that. An experienced family judge who dealt with the case, this is a Newport case, dismissed the care proceedings. One of the features of the case was that it was discovered late on that mother's brother was a Schedule 1 offender. And the judge looked at the possibility that he might have been the man who had been sexually abusing these children. And he said it was now quite clear there is not a shred of evidence against him. It verged on the incredible that he should have had the opportunity to groom and then to abuse his niece on more than one occasion without the parents or the other children becoming aware that something had happened. He's entitled to be wholly and publicly exonerated. Now, that's an extraordinary misunderstanding of what people who've been sent to prison, in this instance for sexually abusing his stepson for a number of years, the predatory nature of the way they groom and go about abusing children. That's the thing they do, isn't it? They sexually abuse without anybody knowing that they're sexually abusing. So what's happened there, isn't it, is that information that is a Schedule 1 offender has been put to the judge, assuming that he'll take with that piece of information all that knowledge about the concealment and the secrecy with which these people actually go about their abusing. And what he obviously did was that spelling out, because he's completely misunderstood the risk of that individual. So, I'll just finish by telling you about a conference, child protection conference I went to in Italy a few years ago, which somebody has to do, don't they? And presentations were by simultaneous translation. So we were listening to a presentation from an Italian social worker, and the sort of thrust of her presentation was that if social workers, she should have said professionals across the spectrum, she said social workers, if they knew more about the way judges go about their job and their responsibilities, how they make decisions and judgments, and judges knew more about the way in which social workers go about their responsibilities, then the outcomes might be better. And over the headphones came, there should be encouraged more coupling between social workers and judges. So we all set up, took a bit more notice. Okay. Deal. Thank you.